The silver plates were still warm when the screaming began. It started with a chair falling, then another, then a glass shattering against the hardwood floor. By the time the grandfather clock struck midnight, every man at the long dining table was on his knees, gasping, clawing at their throats, as if the air itself had turned against them. And at the head of the table, standing calm beneath the chandelier light, was the slave who had served them dinner. He did not run, he did not shout, he simply watched. The candles trembled from the movement of dying men. Shadows shook across the walls. Outside, the plantation fields were silent beneath a moon that gave no warning. By morning, the Whitmore estate would be ruined. But how does a man serve supper with steady hands, knowing it will be the last meal his master ever eats? And why did he wait until 1864, after years of obedience, to destroy everything in a single night? Earlier that evening, Elias moved through the kitchen like he always did. He was careful with the plates, careful with the gravy, careful with the wine. He smiled when spoken to. He bowed his head when dismissed. Nothing in his face betrayed the weight he carried. The Whitmore plantation stood in Georgia, wide and white against acres of cotton fields. The war between the North and South had been burning for 3 years. Confederate officers often dined there, discussing supply routes and troop movements over roasted meat and sweet wine. Elias listened. He always listened, but he never spoke. To the Whitmores he was useful, quiet, educated just enough to read labels and count inventory, dangerous only in imagination. And they believed imagination belonged to white men. They were wrong. Elias had been born on that land. His mother died there. His father was sold south when Elias was 10. He learned early that anger was loud, and loud men died quickly. So he chose silence. Silence let him survive. Silence let him learn. Years passed. He grew taller, stronger, invisible. The master of the house, Thomas Whitmore, was not the worst of men in public. He attended church. He spoke of honor. He spoke of tradition. He spoke of property. Elias was property. When Thomas's son, Edward, returned from military service in 1862, things changed. Edward was younger, faster with his temper, less careful about appearances. He drank more. He laughed louder. And one autumn night, after too much whiskey, Edward decided Elias's younger sister, Ruth, would serve in ways not listed in kitchen duties. Elias heard her crying from the back quarters. He did not move. He did not shout. He pressed his hands into the dirt floor until his nails bled. Anger was loud. Silence survived. The next morning, Ruth would not meet his eyes. By winter, she was gone, sold. Thomas Whitmore claimed it was necessary for finances. Edward avoided the subject entirely. Elias said nothing, but something inside him stopped kneeling that day. Over the next 2 years, the war crept closer. News traveled in whispers, Union forces advancing, plantations burned, slaves fleeing at night. Thomas Whitmore tightened security, patrols doubled, punishments increased. But he never suspected Elias, because Elias never changed. He served breakfast, he polished silver, he bowed, and he listened. So Confederate officers spoke freely at dinner, assuming the enslaved man pouring wine could not understand strategy. Elias understood every word. Supply wagons passed through Whitmore land twice a month. Gunpowder stored in the West Barn. Letters carried between officers and nearby estates. Elias memorized everything. Time was no longer something to endure. Time became a weapon. He waited. He watched. He made small adjustments, a misplaced ledger entry, a slightly incorrect shipment count, a bottle of wine set aside for a particular evening, never enough to raise suspicion. Just enough to prepare. On the night of March 17th, 1864, Thomas Whitmore hosted 4 Confederate officers for dinner. They arrived in polished boots, laughing about rumors of Union weakness. Elias greeted them with the same calm smile he had worn for years. In the kitchen, he opened a small cloth pouch hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside was a powder, not enough to kill quickly, enough to close throats, enough to stop breath. He had learned about it from a traveling doctor who once passed through the plantation months earlier. The man had spoken carelessly about plant extracts while drinking too much brandy. Elias remembered. He always remembered. The powder dissolved easily in hot gravy. It carried no smell, no color, only consequence. Elias stirred the pot slowly. His hands did not shake, because this was not rage, this was balance. Dinner was served at 8. Roasted chicken, butter beans, fresh bread, wine from the cellar. Thomas Whitmore raised a toast to the Confederacy. Edward laughed loudly. The officers ate heartily. Elias stood against the wall, waiting for requests, or waiting for the first cough. It came 20 minutes later. One officer paused, hand at his throat. He tried to speak. Another began to wheeze. Edward stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. Thomas's face turned red, then purple. Panic spread faster than the poison. They reached for water, for air, for help. Elias did not move, because there was nothing to help. Edward locked eyes with him. For the first time in years, the master's son looked at him not as property, but as a man. Understanding dawned slowly. Edward tried to speak, but breath had already betrayed him. They collapsed one by one, heavy bodies striking polished wood. The chandelier swayed gently from the disturbance. Outside, the fields remained quiet. Elias stepped forward only once. He closed Thomas Whitmore's eyes, not from kindness, from completion. Then he walked to the west barn. Inside were barrels of gunpowder meant for Confederate troops. He carried a lantern. The flame was steady, just like his hands. When the first explosion tore through the night, it lit the sky orange. The Whitmore estate burned quickly. Cotton fields caught fire. The grand house cracked and collapsed inward. By dawn, nothing remained but smoke and ash. Elias stood at the edge of the property as Union scouts approached, drawn by the blast. They saw ruin. They saw opportunity. They did not see the quiet man walking away into the tree line. By morning, everything was destroyed. But the story had not ended, because Elias had not done this only for his sister. And the Whitmores were not the only ones who believed they were untouchable. As the sun rose over blackened fields, Elias carried with him a list of names, and Thomas Whitmore had only been the first. The smoke from Whitmore's estate could still be seen from miles away. It rose slowly into the pale morning sky, thin and gray, like the last breath of a dying thing. By the time Union soldiers reached the ruins, Elias was already gone. He did not run toward them. He did not beg for protection. He moved in the opposite direction, into the pine woods beyond the plantation, where the trees stood tall and patient, where the ground was soft with fallen needles, and where men disappeared without leaving names behind. Behind him, the world believed the Whitmores had fallen to accident. A careless lantern, stored gunpowder, wartime misfortune. No one suspected the quiet slave who had served dinner with a smile. That was the first correction, but not the last. Elias walked for hours without stopping. He carried no bag, no visible weapon, only a folded piece of paper sewn into the lining of his shirt. The list, Names written carefully over 2 years, men who had bought and sold lives like livestock, men who had ordered punishments while speaking of Scripture, men who had profited from silence. He had not written the list in anger. He had written it in clarity. The Whitmores had been the center of his world, but not the center of the system that shaped it. They were only one branch of a deeper root, and roots required patience to remove. By midday, he reached an abandoned tobacco shed near the edge of a river crossing. He had chosen it weeks earlier, long before the fire. Preparation was not an act, it was a habit. Inside the shed were simple supplies, a canteen, dried cornmeal, a small knife, a spare clothing stolen piece by piece over months without notice. He changed there, removed the shirt he had worn at the dinner table, removed the identity stitched into its seams. When he stepped outside again, he looked like any displaced laborer wandering the countryside during war. The world was full of such men in 1864, invisible. The war had begun to shift. Union forces pressed deeper into the South. Plantations feared raids. Confederate officers moved constantly, seeking safer ground. Fear made men careless. Careless men revealed information. Elias followed supply roads quietly for days, listening at crossroads taverns, standing near wagon drivers who talked too freely after drink. He learned that the Whitmores had been hosting more than dinners. They had been moving Confederate funds through neighboring estates, money meant to secure land deeds and human property in case the war turned. 3 other families were involved: the Harrows, the Bellamy brothers, Judge Caleb Morton. Elias had served them all at one time or another. He remembered their voices. The Harrows owned the next largest plantation east of Whitmore land. Older men, calculating, less cruel in public, more precise in private. The Bellamy brothers were younger, eager. They handled transport, wagons, documents, shipments of cotton and people. Judge Morton was the quietest of them all. He signed papers, stamped ownership, turned suffering into law. If Whitmore was a visible tyrant, Morton was the foundation beneath him, and foundations did not burn easily. Weeks passed. Elias did not strike again. He watched. So from wooded hills beyond Harrow property, he observed guard patterns. From a stable yard in town, he overheard the Bellamys arguing about delayed payments after Whitmore's death. At the courthouse steps, he listened as Judge Morton assured worried landowners that order would be restored. Order. The word moved easily through their mouths, as if order had never included chains, as if order had not taken Ruth. Elias felt the memory rise sometimes, her quiet face the morning after Edward's cruelty, her absence in winter. He did not let it harden into rage. Rage shortened vision. He required distance. One evening, as rain fell steadily across the countryside, Elias stood beneath the eaves of a general store in town. Judge Morton exited the building, umbrella held neatly overhead. The judge looked smaller than Elias remembered, so age had bent his shoulders slightly. Power had not. Morton spoke to a shopkeeper about property claims, about how certain assets would need redistribution if Union forces arrived. Assets. Elias watched from shadow. The judge's carriage driver held the door open. Morton stepped inside. For a brief moment his eyes swept the street. They passed over Elias without recognition. And that was when Elias understood something important. Men like Morton did not fear fire. They feared exposure. The Whitmores had died violently. It removed them, but it did not reveal them. Morton required a different correction, one that would outlive him. Over the next month, Elias began moving carefully between towns under different names. Laborer here, stable hand there, church helper on Sundays. He learned where documents were stored, where land records were copied, where slave sale receipts were archived. He listened to Union sympathizers whisper in back rooms. Some free black men were quietly passing information to advancing Union officers. Elias approached one such man late at night behind a chapel. His name was Samuel Green. Samuel did not trust easily. "Why help me?" Samuel asked in a low voice. Elias did not speak of revenge. He spoke of records, of hidden Confederate funds, of plantation alliances, of names. He offered information in exchange for something simple: access. Samuel studied him carefully. "You're not doing this for freedom alone," Samuel said. "No," Elias answered calmly. "I didn't think so." Samuel agreed, because justice did not always arrive wearing the same face. Through Samuel, Elias arranged a quiet transfer of information to Union intelligence officers operating nearby. Not rumors, not guesses, precise details, locations of hidden supply stores, dates of financial exchanges, names tied together in documentation, the kind of information that did not burn. It convicted, it dismantled. Union raids soon followed, not randomly but accurately. Harrow storage barns were seized, Bellamy wagons confiscated, Judge Morton's private ledgers examined. The town began to whisper. How had Union forces known exactly where to look? Suspicion moved like cold air through open doors. Morton called emergency meetings. The Bellamys accused each other of loose tongues. The Harrows increased patrols. But the damage was already unfolding, and Elias remained unseen because he did not strike loudly this time. He let their own structure collapse beneath scrutiny. One night in late summer, Elias stood across the street from Judge Morton's home. The windows were lit. Inside, voices rose in argument. Morton's son paced angrily, waving a letter. "They know everything," the young man shouted. "Someone's feeding them names." Morton's voice remained steady but thinner now. "That is impossible." Whitmore thought so too. Silence followed. The name hung in the room like smoke. For the first time, fear entered the judge's household. Not fear of death, fear of being uncovered. Elias watched until the lamps dimmed. He felt no triumph, only progression. But justice required one final act. Information alone would weaken them. Exposure would stain them. Yet there remained something unfinished. Ruth. Months of quiet searching had revealed where she had been sold, transferred to a plantation near Savannah, then moved again when Union forces approached. Records showed she had been purchased by none other than the Bellamy brothers as temporary property during transport. Her trail ended abruptly after that. No sale record, no burial entry, no notation, only absence. Absence was louder than any scream. Elias folded the information carefully. The Bellamys had more to answer for than wagons and ledgers. He would need to confront them directly, not with poison, not with fire, but with something far more final. Because the Bellamys valued one thing above all else: reputation, and Elias now possessed enough truth to destroy it. As he turned from Morton's house that night, he felt the weight of years pressing forward. The system was cracking. The men were afraid, but the name Ruth still echoed unanswered. And if the Bellamy brothers believed their secret was buried with the war, they were wrong. By dawn, Elias had already begun moving south toward Savannah, and this time he did not intend to remain invisible, because some debts were written in paper, but others were written in blood, and the Bellamys would soon learn which kind lasted longer. The road to Savannah was long, quiet, and heavy with heat. Dust rose with each wagon that passed, then settled again as if nothing had moved. The war had carved lines through the land, but life continued in strange halves, fear in one hand, denial in the other. Elias walked steadily south. He did not hurry, he did not hide. He moved like a man who belonged nowhere and therefore everywhere. By now the Harrows were under investigation. Judge Morton's records were being examined by Union officers. The Whitmores were ash. But the Bellamy brothers still operated, still traded, still smiled in public. And somewhere between their ledgers and their transport routes, Ruth had disappeared. Elias did not allow himself to imagine her final days. Imagination could distort truth. He needed facts. Savannah was restless when he arrived. Union forces pressed close to the coast. Confederate officers were anxious. Plantations near the city had begun quietly selling off assets before capture. In times of collapse, men made mistakes. The Bellamy brothers owned a shipping warehouse near the docks. Cotton moved through it. So did people. Elias took work unloading crates under a false name. No one questioned a strong back willing to work for little. He kept his head down. He listened. Workers spoke freely when supervisors were absent. They spoke of the brothers arguing, of missing funds, of shipments that had gone wrong the previous winter. One older dockhand mentioned something else. There was a girl, the man muttered while tying rope. Didn't last long, caused trouble. Elias kept his hands moving. What kind of trouble? He asked quietly. The dockhand shrugged. Refused orders, wouldn't cooperate. One of the Bellamys lost his temper. The rope tightened in Elias's grip. What happened to her? The man hesitated. Sent inland, or so they said. Or so they said. Absence again. But absence was not proof of death. Elias understood something important then. The Bellamys were careless when angry. Edward Whitmore had been careless. Carelessness had revealed weakness. Weakness could be pressed. Days passed before Elias saw them clearly. The Bellamy brothers were younger than most plantation men, tall, clean-shaven, confident in posture. Thomas Bellamy handled business with charm. Henry Bellamy carried impatience like a second coat. Elias observed from distance, watched how Henry barked orders at dock workers, watched how Thomas smoothed conflicts with polite words. Two faces of the same cruelty, one loud, one quiet. Elias needed both. One evening, rain began falling as workers dispersed from the docks. Elias lingered beneath the warehouse overhang. Henry Bellamy remained inside, shouting at a clerk about missing cargo. When the argument ended, Henry dismissed everyone and poured himself a drink from a private cabinet. Elias entered quietly, carrying a crate as if he had been told to fetch it. Henry glanced up. You. What's your name? Daniel, sir. Henry waved dismissively. Set it down and get out. Elias obeyed, but before leaving he spoke, just enough to place a seed. Sir, I heard there were problems last winter with transport. Henry stiffened. What about it? Men talk, Elias said calmly. About a girl. Henry's face shifted, only slightly, but enough. What girl? Henry demanded. Elias lowered his eyes. They said she wouldn't obey, that she vanished. Silence stretched. Henry's jaw tightened. Dock workers imagine things, he snapped. Do your job. Yes, sir. Elias left. He did not look back. Because the seed had been planted. Henry would not sleep well that night. The next week, Elias began spreading small, careful rumors among dock workers. Not accusations, questions. To whispers that Union investigators were asking about missing persons, that transport records were being examined, that names tied to cruelty were being written down. He made sure the whispers reached Henry. Men like Henry Bellamy feared public shame more than private guilt, and Henry's temper began to show. He struck a worker for misplacing paperwork. He shouted at Thomas in front of clerks. Thomas grew anxious. "You're drawing attention," Thomas warned one night in the office. Unaware, Elias listened from outside. "There's nothing to find," Henry insisted. "Then why are you afraid?" Thomas replied quietly. Henry did not answer. Because there was something to find. Elias had confirmed it 2 days earlier. Through Samuel's union contacts, he gained access to confiscated documents from Judge Morton's office. Among them was a temporary transport bill of sale. Ruth's name was listed, purchased for domestic service during transfer, signed by Henry Bellamy. There was no resale record, no transfer, only Henry's signature, and a date that matched the dockhand's memory. Elias folded the copy carefully. Now he had proof, not rumor, not absence, proof. But proof required timing. Justice needed audience. The war itself would provide one. By late autumn of 1864, Union forces tightened their grip on Savannah. Rumors of General Sherman's approach spread fear through the city. Confederate officials began burning documents to avoid capture. Plantation owners scrambled to hide wealth. The Bellamys panicked. Thomas prepared to flee inland. Henry drank more heavily. Elias waited. He knew Union forces would soon seize warehouses near the docks. And when they did, records would be examined. Men questioned, names spoken aloud. The night before Union troops entered Savannah, Elias set his final piece in motion. He delivered a sealed envelope anonymously to a Union officer stationed outside the city. Inside were copies of transport records, names, dates, and a short note. "Look closely at the Bellamy warehouse. One girl did not leave alive." The officer read it carefully. He did not dismiss it. Because the information Elias had provided before had proven accurate. Union troops entered Savannah within days. Warehouses were seized, clerks detained. The Bellamy brothers were summoned for questioning. Elias stood among dock workers as soldiers escorted Henry and Thomas from their office. Henry's face was pale. Thomas attempted composure, but soldiers carried ledgers under their arms. Evidence traveled faster than excuses. During interrogation, the Union officer placed the transport bill of sale on the table. Henry stared at his own signature. "She was property," Henry muttered. "Disobedient." "What happened to her?" the officer asked. Henry hesitated. Thomas looked at him sharply. "Answer." Henry swallowed. "She fell ill." "There's no burial record," the officer replied calmly. Henry's composure cracked. "She fought," he snapped. "Wouldn't comply. I struck her. She hit her head." Silence filled the room. Thomas stared at his brother as if seeing him for the first time. "You told me she was transferred," Thomas whispered. Henry's breathing quickened. "It was an accident." The officer's voice remained steady. "And the body?" Henry closed his eyes briefly. "Waited. In the river." The words hung in the air, heavy or irreversible. Outside, Elias stood in the gray afternoon light as soldiers led Henry away in chains. Thomas followed, shaken, implicated by signature and silence. Dock workers whispered. The story spread quickly, not of rebellion, not of uprising, but of exposure, reputation destroyed, power stripped. Henry Bellamy would face military tribunal for murder under Union authority, Thomas for unlawful trade and concealment. There would be no plantation return, no quiet rebuilding. Their name would carry stain. That night Elias walked to the river. The same river Henry had named. The water moved calmly beneath the moon. No marker stood there, no grave, no stone, but truth had surfaced, and the world now knew. Elias knelt at the edge of the bank. He did not cry. He did not shout. He placed his hand in the water briefly. Cold. Endless. Justice had not restored Ruth. It never could. It had only corrected imbalance. But correction carried cost. Henry's confession would ripple beyond him. Families disgraced, fortunes seized, children marked by their father's crime. Justice rarely stopped at the guilty alone. Elias understood that. He rose slowly. There was only one name left on his list: Judge Caleb Morton, the Foundation, the man who signed papers that turned cruelty into law. Morton had not struck Ruth, but he had made men like Henry possible, and foundations required dismantling. As Elias turned from the river, distant gunfire echoed faintly from the outskirts of the city. War still moved, the world still shifted. But somewhere inland, Judge Morton was preparing his defense, preparing explanations, preparing to survive. He did not yet know that every document he had signed was about to testify against him. And this time there would be no fire, no explosion, only the weight of his own ink. Judge Caleb Morton believed in permanence, not loudly, not with speeches, but with ink. He believed that once something was written, stamped, and filed, it became truth. Land ownership, human ownership, debt, punishment, all of it passed through his desk at one time or another. He had survived the burning of plantations. He had survived the arrest of the Bellamy brothers. He had even survived whispers that Confederate funds were traced through his private ledgers. Because unlike the Whitmores, he had not exploded. Unlike Henry Bellamy, he had not confessed. He had prepared. Morton had begun quietly moving documents months earlier, long before Union troops reached Savannah. Certain land deeds were relocated. Certain sale receipts disappeared. Certain names were removed from public books and rewritten in private copies. He did not panic. He reorganized. He believed the war would end soon enough, one way or another. Governments changed, power shifted, but records endured, and he trusted records. What he did not know was that someone else trusted them too. Elias arrived inland as winter approached. The air was colder now. Trees stood bare against gray skies. The countryside felt quieter after the seizure of Savannah. Confederate influence weakened. Union patrols were more frequent. Morton had retreated to a smaller estate north of the city, less visible, less grand than his previous residence, but secure. Elias did not approach it immediately. He worked first. Or through Samuel's Union contacts, he requested access to confiscated courthouse archives. The Union officers were suspicious at first, but Elias had proven reliable. He did not ask for weapons. He asked for paper, for ledgers, for sealed envelopes bearing Morton's handwriting. Hours turned into days as Elias studied documents under dim lamplight. He saw patterns. Morton had signed off on unlawful transfers during wartime. He had altered sale prices to avoid tax records. He had approved punishments that violated even Confederate statutes. He had quietly profited from it all. Morton had never dirtied his hands, but his pen had been dipped in suffering. Elias copied carefully. He made duplicates of pages, highlighted inconsistencies, not dramatically, not accusingly, simply accurately. Truth required no decoration. By January 1865, Union command began establishing military tribunals for certain offenses committed under Confederate authority. Most cases involved violence. Few involved documentation. Elias changed that. He delivered a portfolio of copied records directly to a Union legal officer stationed near Augusta. The officer read through them slowly. "These are serious allegations," he said. "They are signatures," Elias replied calmly. The officer studied him. "Why bring this forward?" Elias held the man's gaze. "Because men like him believe they will survive the war untouched." Silence. The officer nodded. An investigation began quietly. Morton was summoned under formal notice to present financial and legal records for review. He did not refuse. Refusal would imply guilt. Instead, he arrived composed, carrying his own carefully arranged documents. He believed in control. He believed he could explain discrepancies. He believed war chaos would excuse irregularities. He did not know that copies of his altered entries already sat on the tribunal table. Elias attended the hearing, not in front, not as accuser. He stood at the back of the room, near a window where winter light filtered through dusty glass. Morton spoke confidently at first. "These accusations misunderstand wartime adjustments," he said. "Records were relocated for safekeeping. Certain financial measures were necessary." The tribunal officer placed two ledgers side by side, original courthouse copy, Morton's private version. The differences were precise. Dates altered, amounts changed, names removed. Morton paused, his eyes narrowed. "These must be errors in transcription." The officer turned a page. "Why, your handwriting appears consistent in both." Morton swallowed. He adjusted his spectacles. "Clerical mistakes, under pressure." Another page, another inconsistency, then a signature approving the transfer of Ruth under emergency classification, a classification that bypassed review. Morton's hand trembled slightly. The tribunal officer looked up. "Do you deny approving this transaction?" Morton hesitated. He could deny, but the ink was undeniable. "I signed what was presented to me," he answered carefully. "And you verified its legality." Morton did not respond immediately, because legality had always been flexible under his pen, and now flexibility had hardened into evidence. The room grew still. For the first time, Morton understood something. He was not being accused by rumor. He was being measured by his own record. Elias watched without expression. Justice did not need his voice. It needed Morton's. The hearing lasted hours. Witnesses testified regarding financial irregularities. Union officers outlined unlawful detainment approvals. Morton's defense weakened gradually, not shattered, worn down, like stone against steady water. By late afternoon, the tribunal issued its decision. Judge Caleb Morton would be stripped of legal authority, his properties seized pending further review. He would remain under military supervision for formal charges of unlawful human trafficking and financial fraud. It was not execution. It was dismantling. Morton stood slowly as soldiers approached. He scanned the room, searching faces. His eyes passed over Elias once, then again. Recognition flickered faintly. Morton frowned. "You," he said quietly. Elias did not step forward. Morton's brow tightened. "I've seen you before." "Yes," Elias replied. The single word settled heavily between them. Morton studied him carefully. "Whitmore's estate," he murmured. Elias said nothing. Understanding came slowly, not about the fire, not about the poison, but about pattern. Whitmore dead, Bellamy's arrested. Now him. Morton's voice lowered. "This was you." It was not accusation, it was realization. Elias answered calmly. "No, this was written by you." Morton stared. For a moment, pride and fear battled behind his eyes. Then pride fell away, because he understood what had undone him. Not violence, not rebellion, his own certainty. The certainty that paper could not turn against him. As soldiers escorted him from the room, Morton did not resist. He did not shout. He did not beg. But his posture had changed, bent not by age, by consequence. Snow fell lightly that evening. Elias stepped outside the tribunal building. The air felt sharp, clean. Behind him, Morton's carriage rolled away under guard. The foundation had cracked, not burned, not exploded, corrected. Elias unfolded the small paper from inside his coat. The list: Whitmore, Bellamy, Morton. Each name now crossed through. He stared at the empty space beneath them. Justice was complete, but peace was not. Because in correcting the system, he had reshaped himself. He could not return to invisibility. He could not return to simplicity. He had learned how power moved, how silence could sharpen, how time could be used. The war was nearing its end. Freedom was approaching in law. But freedom did not erase memory. As Elias walked down the snowy road, he sensed something unsettled, not unfinished, changed. Men like Morton had built a world through ink and fear. That world was collapsing. But what would replace it? And who would Elias be in that new world? Behind him, the tribunal lights dimmed. Ahead, the road stretched uncertain and pale beneath winter sky. Justice had been delivered, but its cost was only beginning to reveal itself. Spring came slowly in 1865. The war ended not with a single sound, but with many small silences. Cannon stopped. Letters stopped arriving. Plantations stopped pretending they would return to what they had been. And slavery, written into law for generations, was ending. Elias stood on a quiet hill overlooking a small town as church bells rang in distant celebration. News of surrender had traveled quickly. Men embraced in streets. Soldiers lowered weapons. Freed families wept openly. The world was changing. But change did not erase what had already been written into it. Elias did not cheer. He watched, because his work had never been about celebration. It had been about balance. Thomas Whitmore was dead, buried beneath ash and memory. Henry Bellamy had stood trial under military authority. His confession, written and signed, was entered into record. Witnesses testified about transport abuse. The tribunal found him guilty of unlawful killing. He was sentenced to imprisonment in a military facility until further federal review. Thomas Bellamy lost his business license and property. His wealth dissolved under seizure and debt. He left Georgia quietly, carrying a name that no longer opened doors. Judge Caleb Morton faced formal charges. Though not executed, he was permanently removed from judicial office. His estates were confiscated. Civil suits followed. His reputation, once polished and unquestioned, became synonymous with corruption in wartime records. None of them died dramatically. None of them burned. They simply lost what had made them powerful. And that was enough. Elias rented a small room above a carpenter's shop in a town that barely knew his name. He worked with his hands now, repairing broken furniture and rebuilding frames. Wood made sense to him. You could see where it had cracked. You could measure what needed replacing. There was no hidden ink inside timber. At night, he sometimes unfolded the old paper list, though every name had been crossed out. He kept it not as a trophy, but as proof that silence, used carefully, could shape the world. Samuel visited him once in late spring. "You could speak publicly," Samuel suggested. "Tell your story. People would listen now." Elias considered the idea, but he shook his head. "My story was never meant for crowds," he said quietly. Samuel studied him. "Do you regret it?" Elias thought for a long moment. Justice had cost him years of patience. It had hardened something inside him. He could no longer see the world as simple. He could no longer trust easily, but regret was not the right word. "No," he answered finally. "I understand it." Samuel nodded slowly. Understanding was heavier than anger. One afternoon, Elias walked to the river north of town. Not the Savannah River, a different one. But the water moved the same way, steady, indifferent, endless. He knelt briefly at its edge. Ruth's body had never been recovered. The current had kept its secret. But her name was no longer lost. It existed in military testimony, in tribunal records, in written confession. She was no longer absence. She was documented. Elias placed a small wooden carving into the water, something he had shaped himself. Not a cross, not a symbol of ownership, just a simple piece of smoothed oak. It drifted away quietly. Justice had not brought her back. It had only ensured she was not erased, and sometimes that was the only correction the world allowed. The South began rebuilding. New laws formed, new courts assembled. Some former masters adapted quickly, reshaping themselves to survive. Others faded. Elias remained cautious. He had seen how systems could disguise cruelty as order. He had learned how easily paper could distort truth. So when local leaders asked for volunteers to assist in record-keeping for newly freed families, marriages, births, property agreements, Elias stepped forward. Not for recognition, for accuracy. If ink had once been used to chain, it could also be used to protect. He worked carefully, ensuring names were spelled correctly, ensuring agreements were fair, ensuring no hidden clauses remained buried. He never signed anything without reading it fully. And slowly, people began to trust him, not because they knew what he had done, but because he was precise, fair, calm. Months later, Elias received word that Judge Morton had fallen ill while under supervision. Age and stress had worn him down. Morton requested to speak with certain individuals connected to his case. Elias declined the invitation. There was nothing left to say. Morton's punishment had not been spectacle. It had been exposure. The foundation had cracked and could not be rebuilt. When news of Morton's death eventually reached town, it arrived quietly. No procession, no grand mourning. Just a notice. The world did not stop. And that was the final measure of balance. Years would pass. Children born free would grow without understanding the weight of certain words. Fields would still require labor. Laws would still require watching. But something had shifted permanently. Elias never told anyone about the powder in the gravy, about the lantern in the barn, about the deliberate steps that had begun it all. Those events existed only in his memory, because justice had not been about vengeance alone. It had been about correction. The Whitmore's cruelty ended in a single night. The Bellamy's secret ended in public record. Morton's authority ended under his own handwriting. Each fall had matched its cause. Not louder, not crueler, equal. One evening, as the sun lowered beyond the hills, Elias closed the ledger he had been reviewing for a young couple registering their marriage. He stepped outside into warm air. Children laughed in the distance. A hammer struck wood rhythmically from the carpenter's shop below. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. He stood there for a long time, feeling neither triumph nor sorrow. Justice had been delivered. But it had changed him. He was no longer the boy who pressed his bleeding hands into dirt to keep from shouting. He was not the invisible servant at the wall. He was something steadier, quieter, a man who understood that balance did not come naturally to the world. It had to be made, and once made, it had to be guarded. As darkness settled over the town, Elias returned inside and placed the old crossed-out list into a small wooden box. He did not lock it. He did not burn it. He simply closed the lid. Outside, the world continued, not perfect, not pure, but slightly corrected, and that was enough.